Hello, my name is Shar, and today I'll be doing the second half of my critique of a presentation given by Dr. Richard Carrier entitled, How Do Science and History Prove or Disprove a Religion? Throughout the presentation, Dr. Carrier frequently cites something he calls the God hypothesis. The God hypothesis, according to Dr. Carrier, is a set of predictions that one can make about what we should expect to find in reality if God exists. What Dr. Carrier fails to do is to consider what reality should look like if the God of the Bible exists, and is instead formulating his hypothesis based upon a God of his own imagination.
So history proves God's not been talking. Islam's no different. I'll briefly just say that the Quran also fails to mention germs, incidentally. So when the angel Gabriel was rambling on and on and on with these surahs to Muhammad, you'd think by the end Muhammad would be pissed off that Gabriel didn't at any time mention germs. That would have been really helpful information. By the way, also so would the printing press and a few other things.
Dr. Carrier suggests that God should have revealed germs to the Jewish people. When considering an argument like this, one must be mindful of the fact that God was communicating with an ancient people, and therefore had to use terminology which would be understandable to them. And there are also only about 4,000 words in the Hebrew language. In describing germs to an ancient person, God would have to say that there are organisms which are invisible to the naked eye, but are living and can inhabit your body and cause disease and death to come upon you. An ancient person would automatically classify this as a demon. Then, God would have to explain the kinds of behaviors that would most likely result in a person coming in contact with these organisms, and the best practices on how one is to clean their body, clothing, utensils, and home. This is exactly what we find in the Old Testament.
The Quran also endorses slavery, including sex slavery, which of course the Old Testament also does.
Dr. Carrier suggests that the Bible supports sex slavery. This is false for many reasons, but he's likely referring to a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14, which states the following. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So even in the passage in question, sex slavery is not actually permitted. The woman is to be treated as a wife and not as a slave. She is not to be sold, and Deuteronomy chapter 22 forbids seizing a woman and lying with her against her will. In Leviticus chapter 19, verses 20 and 21 state that a woman is not even actually able to give consent for sexual behavior if she happens to be a slave at the time, and orders a punishment for the man if he engages in sexual activity with a slave.
And therefore the angel Gabriel thought slavery was really cool. Keep up with that. Like Judaism, God's promise of prosperity and superiority over all nations was also refuted by the opposite. Almost all Islamic nations are failed states or economic disasters compared to much of the quote-unquote infidel West, which has all the power and wealth. Now, that doesn't indicate that we're morally better than them, but it does indicate that if we're going to talk about gods helping us out, it looks like our God's doing a better job than theirs.
Dr. Carrier suggests that the Old Testament predicts that the Jewish people will be given a place of world supremacy and global domination, but that the historical record actually refutes this with the opposite in the fact that the Jewish people experienced so much conflict and exile. There are multiple passages in the Old Testament which clearly state that the Jewish people will experience conflict and exile all the way up until the day of the Lord. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 49 and 50, and 62 through 65, it states the following. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. It goes on to say, whereas you were as numerous as the stars of heaven, you shall be left few in number because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God. And as the Lord took delight in doing you good and multiplying you, so the Lord will take delight in bringing ruin upon you and destroying you, and you shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but the Lord will give you there a trembling heart, and failing eyes, and a languishing soul. This is a very clear prediction of a global exile for the Jewish people. Daniel, chapter 9, verses 25 and 26 state the following. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then, After the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. This prophecy sets a very clear timeline between the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the death of the Messiah. It also clearly predicts the subsequent destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which was to begin the global exile. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 10 through 12 state the following: In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. In that day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people, from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations, and will assemble the banished of Israel, and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The root of Jesse is the Messiah. So this prophecy clearly indicates that the Jewish people will not be restored as a nation until after the nations have accepted the Messiah. Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 14 through 16 state the following: Therefore, Son of man, prophesy, and say to Gog, Thus says the Lord God, On that day when my people Israel are dwelling securely, will you not know it? You will come from your place out of the uttermost parts of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great host, a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. In the latter days I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. This is a very clear prediction that God is going to bring a massive army against the nation of Israel after the return from global exile, and immediately prior to the time that he comes in judgment and destroys the nations which are attacking Israel.
But I want to point out that all of these religions are the same religion. In fact, Christianity and Islam are just Jewish sects. They're all just different sects of the same one religion. They're all resurrection cults because they all teach basically the same thing and just differ on the details. Judaism says the world will one day be dissolved, the dead will be raised, and the loyal will become immortal. Christianity says the world will be dissolved, the dead will be raised, and the loyal become immortal. Islam says the world will be dissolved, and the dead will be raised, and the loyal become immortal. It's all the same religion.
Dr. Carrier suggests that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all basically the same religion, and as he puts it, they're all resurrection cults that essentially teach the same thing. Christianity is based upon the belief that the Jewish Messiah has come, and Islam is predicated upon the belief that the God of the Old and New Testament is the true God. That being the case, it really isn't surprising that all three teach that there will be a resurrection at the end of time, because that's what the God of the Old Testament taught from the very beginning. The fact is that Dr. Carrier started out this presentation by arguing that if God exists and has revealed himself, then we should expect a unified message to have been preached by multiple people groups throughout history. He is now arguing that the fact that the major monotheistic religions all teach that there will be a resurrection at the end of time is somehow evidence that God does not exist.
So let's just pick one and analyze it a little more closely. Now, I can't take credit for this, by the way. I'll read it in a moment, but this is a meme that went around on the internet ages ago. Someone else came up with it. They're pretty brilliant because it's spot on. This is the description of Christianity, dead honest. The belief that some cosmic Jewish zombie can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him that you accept him as your master so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. That is literally the Christianity that was being taught in its first, let's say, 1,800 years, almost 2,000 years of Christian history. Totally makes sense, right? Now, a lot of Christians say, "Whoa, okay, that sounds a little ridiculous." Okay, so I get you. That's crazy. So we can make this more sensible. And so we came up with a new and improved Christianity, where all that Eve stuff, okay, rib woman, stalking snakes, okay, that's all baloney. We'll grant you that. We'll concede you that. But I still have an imaginary friend who magically manipulates the world for me, and he also magically impregnated a woman 2,000 years ago, and she bore him a son who underwent an ancient ritual of blood sacrifice in order to dispel a curse laid upon me, thus ensuring I will be immortal. Footnote, although I've never seen this work for anyone else before. Now, that's completely honest and correct analysis of Christianity, a description of it, and yet it looks absurd when you actually spell it out that way.
Dr. Carrier puts forth the meme, which he refers to as a completely honest and correct analysis of Christianity. This meme actually serves as an excellent example of the juvenile view of Christian theology held by many critics. What they'll frequently do has intentionally used childish terms to trivialize our beliefs. For example, referring to Jesus as a cosmic Jewish zombie is intentionally misleading. A zombie is a fictional creature which is supposedly a human who dies and whose body is reanimated by some kind of a virus, who then goes lumbering around seeking humans to eat, as opposed to Jesus, who is, according to Christianity, the creator of the universe who took on human form, lived a perfect life, and then died in our place so that we could be judged as though we lived his perfect life instead of our sinful life, who then was given an eternal spiritual body and resides currently in the immaterial spiritual realm that we would call heaven. Using the term magic to describe divine intervention in the universe is also misleading. Magic is supposedly a set of rituals or incantations that a person can use at their discretion in order to change the way that the universe functions. Miracles, according to Christian theology, are examples of the creator of the universe temporarily superseding the laws of physics so as to produce an effect that can function as a unique proof of his existence to people in select times and places and for a specific purpose. Referring to prayer as telepathic communication is equally misleading. According to Christian theology, prayer is basically just thinking while being cognizant of the fact that the creator of the universe is omniscient and able to know our thoughts. It isn't an ability that we can just turn on and off at our leisure. God hears every thought that goes through our head, so really, everything that we think is a prayer. It's just whether or not we want to be mindful of the fact that the creator of the universe is listening. Referring to God as an imaginary friend is just silly. An imaginary friend is something that a child invents to combat loneliness, whereas God is a concept that is derived from the arguments from natural theology, where we reason from effect back to cause and see that the best explanation for the universe around us is a personal transcendent creator.
But what if someone came up to you and said that they have an imaginary friend named Zalmoxis, who they insist is really real, and they'll never die, because this ancient demigod cleansed their soul with blood magic, which grants them the power of living forever in a magical place no one can see? That actually existed. That was the description of the Zalmoxis cult, which is attested in Herodotus, as I mentioned, 500 years before Christianity. So if Zalmoxis cult is ridiculous, Christianity is ridiculous, because it's just the Jewish version of the same religion.
If a person approached me and said they had an imaginary friend named Zalmoxis who was able to provide them with all of those benefits, I would ask to see what the historical information was that proves that this Zalmoxis character even existed, and what it is about his life that made it so that they believe that he can provide them with all of the benefits listed on Dr. Carrier's slide. The Zalmoxis cult is described in Herodotus. In Herodotus, he plainly states that Zalmoxis dug a hole underground and lived there for 3 years and then came back, as opposed to Jesus, who was killed in public execution, then seen alive in bodily form by multiple witnesses, including best friends who had formerly abandoned him, immediate family members who were not followers of his prior to his execution, and his biggest opponent in Saul of Tarsus, who was later named Paul the Apostle. The only thing that can reasonably account for the massive change that took place in the lives of these individuals is that their testimony of having seen Jesus alive from the dead is true.
But let's go to history more recent. Heaven's Gate cult. The Heaven's Gate cult was in California, and they committed suicide, mass suicide, believing that their souls or the information in their brains would be teleported into a spaceship. They thought they'd get new bodies in this alien spaceship that was flying by the Earth at the time, and yet this whole belief, this idea that when they die that they'll be resurrected in new superior bodies, that's the Christian belief. This is just the scientific version of Christianity. So you have them saying that they'll get new bodies in an alien spaceship flying by, versus what the Christians say is that they'll get new bodies in a magical alternative universe. The weird thing is that the Heaven's Gate cult makes more sense, right? Because in point of fact, they're talking about quantum teleportation and neural engineering, which are actual things that exist. We almost have the technology now. We can see how to build this technology within 50 to 100 years. We'll have it. It'll be a simple matter to simply copy a brain and rebuild it in another man-made body. All of that stuff is technology that's within human reach and within human understanding. So their idea actually made sense. There really could have been a flying saucer flying by, and if there was, and that those aliens probably could have scanned their brains and reproduced them in new, superior synthetic bodies on the ship. It's entirely possible.
Dr. Carrier suggests that the Heaven's Gate cult is more reasonable than Christianity because Christians teach that miracles took place, whereas the Heaven's Gate cult is founded on the belief that there were aliens who possessed technology that could someday actually exist. The issue here is not the plausibility of miracles or the possibility of this technology existing. The issue is the fact that the members of the Heaven's Gate cult believed as they did because they accepted a story, which was a private revelation from their leader, and they accepted this on blind faith. The leader gave no evidence, and there was no corroborating witnesses to the story. As opposed to Christianity, which has 4 historical biographies written about our leader by some of the most highly educated and expertly trained people living in and around the societies in which the events took place, who attribute countless miracles having been performed in the presence of numerous witnesses.
But compare this with what the Christians are saying. The Christians are saying not that. They're saying that God needs blood to fix the universe, but only his own had enough magical power to do it, so he gave himself a body and then killed it. Now, when you look at it like this, Christians are talking about voodoo and magic and stuff. They're not talking about anything that even has plausibility. The Heaven's Gate cult is actually more believable than Christianity. So if the Heaven's Gate cult is absurd, Christianity is absurd.
Dr. Carrier suggesting that Christians believe that God needed blood to fix the universe is called a straw man argument. A straw man argument happens when a person intentionally or unintentionally misrepresents the position of their opponent and then argues against that misrepresentation. What Christians actually believe is that God created us with free will and knows that every human at some point in their life will choose to disobey him. That being the case, and God being perfectly just, cannot allow our sin to go unpunished. So what he chose to do instead of giving us the punishment that we deserve is take on human form and live a perfect life and then die in our place so that we can be judged as though we lived his perfect life instead of our sinful life. This way, the sin is punished and his sense of justice is satisfied.
So, okay, that all looks bad. But the usual thing is, can't we fix the plot holes with elaborate explanations? And I've misspelled explanations, I see here. Excanations? I was hoping there'd be a joke in there somewhere, but there really isn't. Can't we make excuses? But the thing is, if we have to make excuses, regardless of what they are, and our excuses have no evidence for them, in other words, and they don't, because that's why we're making them up, right, on the spot, and those excuses are very improbable, and they typically are, like having an excuse not to mention to your own devoted believers for thousands of years that they shouldn't be keeping slaves. If your excuses are very improbable, then your theory is very improbable. If you have to use an improbable excuse to tack that onto your theory, the improbability of that excuse then attaches to the theory, right? So the theory becomes as improbable as your excuse, or actually more improbable, because if you have multiple excuses, those improbabilities multiply, right? And those of you who know how to do basic probability math, basic multiplying of probabilities, you'll notice that this probability gets smaller, smaller, smaller exponentially.
Dr. Carrier suggests that Christians have to make elaborate and improbable excuses to fill the plot holes in the biblical narrative. This isn't true. The only reason we'd have to make excuses is if it was the case that the false characterization of Christianity presented by Dr. Carrier was true. Christianity, as taught in the Bible, doesn't require any elaborate excuses or explanations, just a willingness to consider the possibility that a miracle could have occurred on the testimony of another.
And the fact still is that God has never communicated any essential scientific knowledge, ever. No germ theory of disease is in the Quran, in the Old Testament, or the New Testament, for example, nor anything else that's significant like that.
Dr. Carrier suggests that God has never communicated any essential scientific or moral knowledge, or any consistent religious knowledge, despite claims going back 40,000 years. First, as we learned in the first half of my critique of Dr. Carrier's presentation, God did actually reveal to the Israelites how to make soap well over 1,000 years before humans discovered it on their own. Second, there are multiple chapters in the Old Testament dedicated to diagnosing and preventing the spread of disease by quarantine. There are also multiple chapters dedicated to describing which animals the Israelites were allowed and not allowed to eat because certain animals carried high levels of disease and bacteria.
God has also never communicated any essential moral knowledge. For example, he completely dropped the ball on slavery.
The Bible states that God communicated the moral law to each and every one of us through our innate conscience and our knowledge of objective moral values and duties. In addition to this, Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34 state the following: "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So it's very clear here that a sojourner, or a person who is not an Israelite, who is traveling through or living in the land of Israel, is to be treated as an Israelite himself, and this is very clearly stating the golden rule that you shall love another as you love yourself. Dr. Carrier suggests that God should have spoken against slavery. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, it states the following: "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death." This is a very clear command that a person is not to be stolen and made to work as a slave. Slavery in the Old Testament was a social safety net that was to be entered into willingly, either because a person found themselves so severely in debt that they had to sell their labor to a wealthy person in order to survive, just like we sell our labor now in order to survive, or they were participating in a military campaign against the nation of Israel and were captured and offered to work as slaves instead of dying on the battlefield, which was actually a merciful option.
God has never even communicated any consistent religious knowledge of any kind, despite claims going on for 40,000 years, all these different religions, no consistency whatsoever. So these facts remain, no matter what excuses you make for them. And these three facts are exactly what you'd expect if there are no gods, but they're not at all what you expect if there are gods.
Again, Dr. Carrier is suggesting that God should have communicated a consistent religious message to multiple people groups throughout history, but then when he does find examples of this happening, he automatically dismisses it as one group having borrowed the story from another anyway.
Okay, so maybe we can grant that. What if God is a total man, right? Can't there be one of those? And at least then maybe, yeah, he doesn't care about germs or slaves. Maybe, yeah, he's totally pro-slavery. He wants us to die of diseases. He's a total awful. Okay, but he could still exist, right? So you really haven't refuted God yet.
Dr. Carrier uses a pejorative term to describe God and suggests that God has committed some kind of a moral injustice by allowing humans to die from various diseases caused by germs. What Dr. Carrier fails to recognize is the fact that God created us in the first place and that our mortal flesh has to die in order for us to receive our immortal bodies. Therefore, God is just turning us into what he always intended for us to be and is not committing any kind of injustice on anyone by allowing them to die at the time and place that he chooses. God allowing for the mortality rate to be as high as it is allows for a greater number of people to have existed throughout history who have an opportunity to respond positively to whatever level of revelation God provided them with and enter a perfect eternal life in the immortal spirit body. God allowing for the pediatric mortality rate to be as high as it is allows for a greater number of people to have existed who go straight on to an immortal, perfect life with no risk of hell.
So there's really two possible kinds of gods. The one is natural beings, which are aliens, computers, and things like that. We could be living in the Matrix right now, and the gods could be our AI agents or whatever. But we're going to rule that out because that requires positing two improbable universes to explain one of them. So that leaves us with the other kind of God, which is the supernatural being, the being that has irreducibly mental powers, a sort of a brainless, bodiless ghost mind that can just will things into existence. There are two hypotheses then left. The God hypothesis, which is that the universe was designed, by a ghost even, to produce life. The godless hypothesis, that the universe was not designed to produce life.
Dr. Carrier suggests that the God hypothesis is that the universe was designed by a ghost to produce life. In reality, what theists actually believe is that since space, matter, and time all came into being in a moment at the Big Bang, then whatever caused the Big Bang cannot have been made of space, matter, or time. Thus, we have a spaceless, timeless, and immaterial creator of the universe, which is what we call God. A ghost is a disembodied human spirit. This is obviously not what Christians think or have ever thought.
And the first thing you look at is when you compare these two hypotheses is that we've done this comparison before, again and again and again. The explanation of lightning, the explanation of disease. Jesus thought it was demons. It actually turned out to be germs. And on and on and on. We have constant millions and millions of examples of where supernatural explanations were proffered and they turned out to be false, and natural explanations turned out to be true instead. Now, when you have a horse that wins every single one of 1,000,000 races, and you have another horse that loses every single one of 1,000,000 races, and they're about to go head-to-head in another race, which horse do you bet on? It's kind of a no-brainer conclusion, right? So even from the start, before I even continue, I could fold this and walk off stage and I'd be done, right? There's no probable basis for believing in any gods, even gods.
Dr. Carrier suggests that since naturalistic explanations have been found for things like lightning, we should not posit a supernatural explanation for the origin of the universe because, as he puts it, you shouldn't bet on a losing horse. In reality, Dr. Carrier is committing something called a category error. Even if it was the case that the natural sciences could produce a physical description of what took place in the beginning of the universe in terms of physics and chemistry, it would be irrelevant to whether or not a conscious agent was responsible for bringing it all to pass. To suggest that we don't need to posit a conscious agent because we have a physical description from the natural sciences would be like suggesting that since we can study the science of internal combustion, we don't need to posit Henry Ford as the inventor of the motor vehicle.
But I'm going to go on because it's funny. Now, unfortunately, my animations aren't working, so I'll talk you through this slide. This is the history of life, right? So we've got 2.4 billion years. Life began, and then there were about 2.4 billion years after that, where life was just sitting around evolving as single-celled life. Now, in actual fact, single-celled life is over 6 times more evolved than plants and animals just by time alone, right? Animals have only been around about 0.6 billion years. In other words, 600 million years, whereas single-celled life has been around 3.7 billion years, so about 6 times more. So single-celled life, bacteria, for example, have been evolving 6 times more longer than we have. So they're actually way more evolved than we are. But in fact, the rate of evolution for single-celled life is actually 500,000 times faster than for multi-celled life like animals, which means that single-celled life is actually many billions of times more evolved than your hand, for example. So single-celled life is bad. Now, that makes a lot of sense in terms of evolutionary theory, but it makes no sense in terms of God. God really likes bacteria. I mean, he spent most of his time working on those suckers, but very little of his time working on us. So what was God doing for the 2.4 billion years fiddling around? And he's got all these single-celled organisms. He doesn't know what to do with them. He can't even figure out that maybe they could work together to do something. And then eventually he comes up with the idea that, you know what, maybe they could congregate together and make more complex entities, like algae. Algae, that's clever. So he creates things like algae where multiple cells can cooperate. But he's still sticking around with those for 1 billion years before he realizes, oh, you know what, maybe I should have these cells differentiate their function so that we can have a more complex animal. Yeah, why didn't I think about that 3.4 billion years ago? Still couldn't figure it out, but eventually did, and he comes up with this differentiation of cells within a multi-celled organism about 0.6 billion years ago. But then it takes him 500 million years to figure out apes, just apes, right? So he's tinkering around with mice and bugs and all kinds of this stuff, but no, it takes him a while to go, apes. Oh, right, maybe I should do something with those. And then even when he gets to apes, it takes him 4 million years more of tinkering before he figures out how to make people. What was he doing for 4 million years? God, these apes are really stupid. Why can't I fix them? They should be smarter than this. Oh, right, maybe I should do something with the brain. I don't know. When you look at this, you realize that this is exactly what we should expect if life is a natural product of random evolution. It would obviously take billions and billions of years for us to evolve. Obviously, single-celled life would have to evolve vastly longer in order to develop the intercellular machinery and complexity to actually start engaging in cooperation. And obviously, once you have cells engaging in cooperation, it would take a very, very long time for them to evolve the sophisticated machinery that would allow them to start differentiating tissues and therefore creating what we recognize as plants and animals. So this is exactly what we expect if there's no God. It makes no freaking sense if there is a God. Even if God would be more time efficient than this.
God is timeless, so the amount of time that passed between him doing this or that is totally irrelevant. And for Dr. Carrier to suggest that God didn't know what to do with his creation is a completely baseless assertion. Dr. Carrier suggests that God fiddled around with his creation for billions of years not knowing what to do with life. In order to formulate a hypothesis as to what a person intended to do with his creation, one has to get to know the Creator. If Dr. Carrier is intent upon mischaracterizing the God of the Bible so severely, it's no surprise whatsoever that he's unable to accurately discern what his purpose was for the earth.
So what does the godless hypothesis predict? This is what we would expect to see. If we are alive, if we exist, and there is no God, and the universe therefore had to have come about by random chance or whatever, what would we expect to observe? What could we predict about the universe we find ourselves in? The moment we open the door and look outside, what would we see? What we would see is that almost all of the universe will be lethal to life, right? If you pick random universes, you're going to get one that, you know, if it's a universe that's completely hostile to life, obviously that you're never going to be in that universe, right? Because if you're alive, you're not in that universe. So you would never observe that universe. The probability of that being outside when you open the door is 0%. But if the universe is randomly picked from among all the possible universes that could just by chance maybe produce life, then what you're going to see outside that door, if it's not been intelligently designed, is a universe that's almost entirely lethal to life, but life is just a very small, very rare occasional outproduct of it. Now, because we know, in this case, if life is not engineered, if it's not intelligently designed, it has to be an extremely improbable chemical accident. The right chemistry has to come together just the right way. So we know that's a cat. We have to concede that. That's true. If there's no God designing things, there's no designer, that's the only way life could come about. But we also know from probability theory that extremely improbable events almost always occur only in vast spaces and timescales. In other words, if an event is 1 billion to 1 against, but you have 1 billion events, right? So the odds of you having one of those events is actually quite high. So what you would expect to see outside that door is a really enormous number of failed attempts to create life and just one or a few random successes, because that's what you would normally appear to see if there's no design.
The reality is that God doesn't need to produce the universe that can harbor life on multiple planets if it was the case that he wanted to create beings who were capable of free will and therefore freely entering into a relationship with him that only existed on one planet. The only way to know if a tool is well designed is to know what the tool was designed for.
But that's what we notice, right? This is what we look at. When we look outside that door, what we see is a universe that trudged along for 10 billion years before life began on Earth. We see there are trillions of galaxies, with billions of stars each, and many planets and moons on average per star. And that's just the part of the universe we can see, by the way. The universe is actually predicted to be many times larger than even the part we can see, so that trillions is probably a low estimate, a very low estimate of galaxies. And we notice that single-celled life, like I pointed out, evolved for 2 billion years before multicellular life arose from it. All of these things that we expect to see if life is a product of random chance and not a product of design.
Dr. Carrier ignores the purpose that God has revealed that he has for this universe and humanity in the text of Scripture. The Bible is very clear that God always intended for this universe to be temporary and for humanity to live in the eternal universe that's coming after this one. It's also very clear that Dr. Carrier hasn't spent any time considering how the universe would look if the God of the Bible actually exists.
We could have predicted that without even knowing it before we looked outside the door. But it gets worse than that. When you look at the universe and map and catalog what's in it, 99.99999% of the universe is a lethal radiation-filled vacuum. Think about that. That's almost the entirety of the universe. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit that is not a lethal radiation-filled vacuum. So God really, really likes lethal radiation-filled vacuums if he's the designer. But it gets worse than that, because once you erase all of that and let's just focus on the stuff. Okay, there's very little stuff. It's almost all deadly space. But what's left, let's look at that. We just look at the material. 99.99999% of all the material in the universe composes stars and black holes on which nothing can live, right? Think about that. Like, most of the matter in the universe is dedicated to these gigantic things called stars and black holes that are vastly huger than planets. All that mass, and they are exactly the one place where life is not going to be found. They're incredibly lethal and hostile to life. You can't live there. And then, okay, so set aside all of that and just look at the tiny little crumbs that remain. 99.99999% of all the other material in the universe, space dust, asteroids, planets, moons, is barren of life or inhospitable to life. That's an extremely bizarre thing to observe for an intelligently designed universe that's supposed to be custom built to make life, right? This is actually the opposite of what we would expect then. But this is exactly what we'd expect to see the moment you open the door if there is no God, because the only universe we could be in is one like this. Or at least the probability is extremely high. That's what we'd see. And I want you to think about this in terms of scale. Imagine this house that I've got up here. Now imagine this house contains the entire universe that we know about, the entire known universe. The amount of volume in this house that would be hospitable to life, the rest of it is completely entirely lethal to life. The amount of volume that would be hospitable to life would be smaller than a single proton. Not smaller than a bacterium, even smaller than the proton in an atom in a bacterium. If you walked into that house, you see that it's almost entirely lethal to life, and you couldn't even find the one proton that life was living on in there. Would you conclude that the house was designed to create life or designed to be hospitable to life? No, you'd conclude the opposite.
Dr. Carrier asks if it would be reasonable for us to conclude that a house was built to harbor life in the event that you found that the house was 99.99999% inhospitable to life. The fact is that if I found a house, I would want to consult the builder of that house to determine what his purposes were in building the house in the first place. The percentage of the universe that's hospitable to life is totally irrelevant to whether or not it was created with humans in mind.
Now, it's worth pointing out that Aristotle actually thought the universe was much more conducive to life than this, and he described it a complete cosmos. In going all the way to the stars, it was completely inhabited and completely inhabitable. Aristotle's universe was 10 to the power of 30 times more hospitable to life than ours is, which means Aristotle is a vastly better engineer of universes than God would be, apparently. I think even God could outdo Aristotle, but evidently not.
Dr. Carrier suggests that Aristotle must be a better designer than God because Aristotle was able to conceive of a universe that was 10 to the 33rd power more hospitable to life than the universe that we currently reside in happens to be. This would be equivalent to me saying that I could invent a drug which cures every disease and will make your IQ go up by 100 points and will make you go down to 8% body fat within a month, so I'm the best doctor that there is. The fact that Aristotle wasn't actually able to make a universe is a very significant factor.
So the results. We cannot predict any distinct features of this universe on the God hypothesis. Almost all the distinct features of it are unexpected. To the contrary, the God hypothesis predicts very different observations should be made, but we can successfully predict numerous very weird features of this universe, its vast size and its incredible lethality and all of that, on the godless hypothesis. In fact, the probability that the universe would look like this, the way I've described it, is 100% expected. It's exactly the universe we should expect to see the moment we look out the door.
Dr. Carrier suggests that we are unable to predict any distinct features of this universe using the God hypothesis. The fact is that this is only true of the God of Dr. Carrier's imagination. If we use the God of the Bible in this hypothesis, then we can actually predict many features of this universe. For example, the fact that the universe had a beginning, and that the earth was at one time an uninhabitable waste, from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, the shape of our planet, along with the fact that we live in an expanding universe, from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, the fact that the earth hangs on nothing, from Job chapter 26, verse 7, the fact that the universe is subject to the same pervasive law of decay as clothing and will end, from Psalm 102, 25 through 27, the fact that there are an innumerable but finite number of stars, from Psalm 147, verse 4, and Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 22, the fact that matter is no longer being created and cannot be destroyed, from Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, and Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 14, the fact that the universe and the foundations of the earth cannot be measured, from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 37, the fact that humans and animals are made out of the same thing as the earth, meaning we are carbon-based life forms, from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 19 to 20, and the biological diversity of life with the fact that there are genetic barriers between species, from Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, along with many other things about our earth and universe all throughout the Old and New Testament.
Now, so then what they'll come up with is, well, but fine-tuning is so improbable, and the universe requires fine-tuning. The problem is that their God requires more fine-tuning. In fact, they're proposing, first of all, they're proposing something we have no evidence of, a brainless mind, a mind without a body. We have no evidence that that's even a possible thing. So they're already off the rails from the start. But
Dr. Carrier suggests that there is no evidence of a non-physical, or as he puts it, brainless mind. In reality, our universe is governed by logical laws like the law of non-contradiction or the laws of mathematics, which exist prior to and independently of the laws of physics, and govern the way the laws of physics function. Logic cannot exist without a mind, so this suggests that a mind exists prior to and independently of the laws of physics, and which governs the way that they function. Also, space, matter, and time all came into being at the Big Bang. Thus, the cause of the Big Bang must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. The possible options for what could be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial are either an abstract object like a number, or a disembodied mind. Since abstract objects like numbers can't stand in causal relationship with anything, this suggests that there is a disembodied mind which exists prior to and independently of the universe, and was responsible for bringing it into existence. Additionally, the fact that linear time came into existence at the Big Bang, along with the fact that an actual infinite number of moments cannot have passed between the beginning of the universe and now, otherwise we would never arrive at now, indicates that we have an eternal cause with a temporal effect. If a cause is mindless, then as soon as the necessary conditions are met, then the cause will take place, like a ball falling from the sky. This suggests that the universe, in its coming into existence, is more like a ball being thrown up, which requires a conscious agent.
even if we grant them that, what they're proposing is that there is a mind that just happens to exist for no reason, that is at least as complex as a human mind, because he has to be at least as intelligent as a human and have at least as much knowledge as a human. In reality, of course, their God, they're imagining, is vastly greater than that and therefore vastly more complex. But if you're going to pick random soulless or random bodiless minds out of a grab bag of all logically possible bodiless minds, and you want to get something that's human, intelligent, or better, you're going to have to get information specificity equivalent to human or better. In fact, information specificity, the complexity of human intelligence, is in the vicinity of 10 to the power of 5 billion. So think about that, 10 to the power of 5 billion. That's extraordinarily unlikely. In other words, the attributes required for a creator are extraordinarily improbable attributes to have. Theology thus posits an even greater coincidence than a random universe. They want to explain a mildly finely tuned universe by positing a massively finely tuned God, and not explaining where that fine tuning came from. Maybe they'll go to gods all the way down, like the turtle argument, but I think that's a losing way to go, and you know they won't go there.
Dr. Carrier suggests that the attributes of a creator are extraordinarily improbable attributes for a being to have. The fact is, we do not believe that the creator came about by random chance. We believe that he exists as an eternally necessary being. So the probability or improbability of his having the attributes that he has is totally irrelevant to whether or not he exists. Dr. Carrier pointing out the information specificity required for a human mind to exist is totally irrelevant to whether or not a mind that is more complex than that can exist outside of the universe. We don't believe that God's mind came about by random chance, so the probability of its occurring is totally irrelevant.
So here's the summary. No moral God is likely to exist on present evidence, quite clearly. Only very improbable excuses can rescue God from that.
Dr. Carrier suggests that no moral God is likely to exist. The fact is that without the option to commit moral evil, then free choice is really just an illusion. And objective morality wouldn't exist unless there's a mind that exists independently of and prior to the universe, which governs the way that it functions.
No supernatural causes or communications have ever been discovered, but millions of natural ones have. Excuses make no difference to the resulting probability. And the universe is contrary to predictions of any likely God hypothesis. Only improbable excuses make it fit. And the universe is exactly what is predicted by the godless hypothesis. Even really weird predictions come true.
Dr. Carrier suggests that no supernatural communications have ever been discovered. This is plainly false to anybody who's taken the time to carefully read through the Old Testament and saw the vast number of prophecies with multiple levels of stipulation, which are all fulfilled by parties outside of the nation of Israel, which are absolutely impossible for the prophets to have guessed. In addition to this, the fact that the Bible was composed by 40 different authors over the course of 1,500 years, who collectively produced an extremely complex and integrated messaging system, demonstrates the true unity of divine authorship of the Bible.
And that's the state of things, and that's where we get from science and history. So we could write Ulan Khulufad's book long before he actually is supposed to have written it, according to Douglas Adams. And I could say, well, that about wraps it up for God. Thank you.
The arguments put forth by Dr. Carrier serve as an excellent representation of the kinds of arguments that you will hear from people who reject the Christian worldview on scientific grounds. The size or age of the universe are totally irrelevant questions to whether or not it was created by a conscious agent, and the complexity and information specificity required for life to exist around us as it does only serves as an argument for there being a divine mind controlling it all. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.